Before we get started, I have a quick favor. I've been self-funding the Finding Genius podcast for 5 years now. I've done over 3,000 episodes. And as you can see on YouTube, we're up over 1 million views on the channel, which is fantastic. The next thing I really want to push on is to get up to 10,000 subscribers. Because once we do, we'll be able to put a donate button and we'll be able to solicit donations to help keep the podcast running and to also get the Finding Genius Foundation moving along. We have a big project studying anxiety, depression, and PTSD and working on a product to help people overcome these problems because I've seen them explode recently after the last 2 years of the whole virus situation. So if you would, please subscribe to the podcast. That would help us tremendously. Give us a thumbs up and check in the description for Buy Me a Coffee. It's about $5. If you could buy me a coffee, I'd really appreciate it. It would help keep the channel going, and I love coffee. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Dustin Moody from the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and I look forward to sharing my expertise about post-quantum cryptography. Tune in to learn about the latest NIST standards on post-quantum cryptography that were recently released.
Forget frequently asked questions.
Common sense, common knowledge, or Google.
How about advice from a real genius? 95% of people in any profession are good enough to be qualified and licensed. 5%
go above and beyond.
they become very good at what they do, but only
0.1%
are real geniuses. Richard Jacobs has made it his life's mission to find them for you. He hunts down and interviews geniuses in every field: sleep science, cancer, stem cells, ketogenic diets, and more. Here come the geniuses. This is the Finding Genius Podcast
with Richard Jacobs.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Finding Genius Podcast. My guest today is Dustin Moody. He's a mathematician. He's part of the National Institute of Standards and Technology called NIST. We're going to talk about computer security. That's the division he's in, quantum computing and how it's going to affect current algorithms in use, and security surrounding computers. So welcome, Dustin.
Thank you, Richard. Glad to be here.
Yeah, tell me a bit about your background and how and why you came to NIST first.
Well, I'm a mathematician. I've always loved math, and in college, that's what I got my degree in, and ended up with a Ph.D. My area of study is an area called number theory, specifically something called elliptic curves, which are these beautiful mathematical objects that have a lot of really neat structure. Turns out that they're useful in cryptography, so I kind of got into cryptography a little bit, and then that was my connection to how I ended up at NIST, is that it turns out there are real-world cryptosystems that we use today that rely on elliptic curves, and so that was my draw to NIST and ended up here.
Yeah, I know in the crypto world, with Bitcoin and all that, from what I understand, it uses, public and private keys and elliptic curve cryptography. Any insights that you could tell listeners that are, lay people about, about crypto based on your mathematical knowledge of this?
Yeah, there's all sorts of different types of mathematics that underpin the security of the crypto systems we use today. There's as simple as factoring numbers. So the number 27, you can factor it into its primes, 3 times 7, and that's easy enough. But there's a crypto system we use called RSA that its security depends on the fact that we choose numbers that are so large that computers can't factor efficiently. So it uses numbers that are hundreds of decimal digits long. And so, yeah, math is one of the specialties that's needed for cryptography. There are other areas, too, that come into play. I need computer scientists and so forth. But it's pretty fascinating. It's kind of cool you mentioned crypto. Many people today, when they hear crypto, they instantly think of Bitcoin or cryptocurrency, which are built on top of using cryptographic algorithms. But it's kind of a different branch than what mathematicians and cryptographers think of as crypto.
Okay. So what are you working on specifically in regards to quantum computing at NIST?
So at NIST, I'm the lead of a project called post-quantum cryptography. And the idea behind that are researchers have been working on building what are called quantum computers for quite a while. And quantum computers are devices that rely on principles of quantum physics in a different way than our current classical computers do. And this quantum physics can often have really counterintuitive properties. And physicists have been able to figure out a way to exploit that into getting really amazing computational power for certain algorithms for certain problems. And so that's why companies are trying to build these things. If you were able to build a good-sized quantum computer, you'd be able to design drugs way more efficiently than we can today, or do way better weather forecasting. And there's lots of positive benefits to society. On the flip side, it's been known since the 1990s that if you did have a big quantum computer, you would be able to break a lot of the cryptography that we rely on today to protect our information. So this project is geared at finding new solutions to protect us from a future quantum computer, because the ones we use today are vulnerable to attacks from a quantum computer.
Yeah, what kind of problems are susceptible to a quantum computer? Which ones are not? Like, what is the sweet spot of operation for one versus traditional computing?
Yeah, so the cryptosystems we use today, there are two different buckets you could put them into. There's what's called public key or asymmetric cryptography, and that's where the cryptosystem has a private key and a public key. And using that, you can do things. You can do public key encryption, where you can send a message to somebody you've never met by looking up their public key, and using their private key, they can decrypt it. You could also do authentication, or what's called digital signatures, kind of an electronic form of a signature where you're proving who you are by signing a document, and somebody else can come along and do a computation to verify your signature and know that it was you. They can do that. So that is public key cryptography. There's also symmetric key cryptography, and that's where you and the other person that you're communicating with, you've already established a shared key in some way, and using that, you can do a lot of crypto that's way more efficient. It's a lot faster. So typically you'll use public key cryptography to either authenticate or to establish that initial shared key. And then once you have that initial shared key, you'll switch over and use symmetric key algorithms, something like AES, the Advanced Encryption Standard. So the effect of quantum on all of that is that it's really the public key algorithms that are vulnerable to these attacks. There's a couple different problems that public key cryptosystems are based on. Factoring that I already mentioned, and there's another one known as the discrete log problem.
For the factoring problem, so these are like really large numbers, and to find the factors, as I understand it, there's no formula, so it's a brute force type of thing. And if the number is sufficiently large, it would take a computer, thousands of years to get to the factors. Is that how that works and why it's projective?
Yes, for classical computers. And it's not entirely brute force. I'd say it's intelligent brute force. There's some techniques to speed up the process. But yeah, it's that the numbers are too big that these techniques would take thousands of years before they'll find the factor.
And with quantum computing, because it can be massively parallel and you can try many different guesses, I guess, at the same time, you could reduce the time to crack one of these to how short a time?
Yeah, so it's hard to predict exactly the time because we don't yet have a quantum computer that we can actually build that's large enough to do this in, at current security levels. But it's estimated that if you get a big enough one, it would take hours to break a system today that we use for current levels of security.
Yeah, that's not long. That's crazy.
No, it's really not. And that's why we have to come up with new solutions to this.
Well, why not just extend the number of bits used, So if you have a 256 digit number, or why not 1024? So then you push off the problem of quantum computing for 10 more years.
So that is an idea that people have considered. There's that RSA, the system used on factoring. Currently, you'll use 2048-bit keys. If you want to go really high security, you go up to 4096-bit keys. Somebody did the research on this and said, okay, if you want to protect from a quantum computer, they developed it, and it's called post-quantum RSA. The public key is ginormous. If you were to print it out on paper, it would go from like here to the moon. So it's just, you could do that in theory, but in practice, the key sizes that you would have to use are so huge that it would be inefficient and no one would ever want to implement it in real life.
So it's going to run into a wall no matter what happens. The different ways needed.
Yes, we have to come up with an alternative solution that is not vulnerable to that attack. But that is a good thought on where you want to try.
So we went through the factoring issue. Then I interrupted you. I'm sorry. There was the second very common method that you're going to talk about.
Yeah. So the other one is called discrete log. It's a little bit more mathematical to explain. The idea is that you have what's called in mathematical terms a group, and you have an element that generates that whole group. And you can generate the group by taking that element, we'll just call it G, and multiplying it by itself as many times as you would like. It turns out it's a hard problem that if you choose big enough numbers, if I give you that generator and I give you a random element of the group to tell me how many times you had to multiply G together to get that random element that I gave you. So that's called the discrete log problem. And amazingly enough, it's the same quantum algorithm called Shor's algorithm that can defeat factoring and the discrete log problem. There's no reason why that should happen. It just turns out that it's the case.
Is it because it's similar mechanism of problem? It's the ability to make quadrillions of guesses simultaneously is what overwhelms the system?
Well, that's the very, very short answer. When you get into the details, it's more complicated than that. What Shor's algorithm does is it's a sophisticated algorithm to find the period of a repeating function, or the period is how often that a function repeats. And when he came out with this algorithm, he noticed that you could turn both factoring and discrete log. Finding the solution for him, you could transform the problem so that it's a question about finding the period with which they repeat in a certain instance. So that's the angle that it gets at. And yeah, it does use principles of, quantum computer. Naively, you can think of it as being able to do a huge number of things in parallel, that it's able to speed up that computation compared to a classical computer.
Okay, so what kind of problems are quantum computers not amenable to?
So yeah, mathematicians and computer scientists have looked for a few decades and tried to come up with what can a quantum computer not break. And there have been a few different families that over a couple decades we've started to gain confidence in. There's nothing about these that guarantees that a quantum computer would never be able to crack, or even that a classical computer would never be able to crack. We don't have just such absolute guarantees. What it is that we gain confidence that experts have studied these problems for a very, very long time, and all known attacks don't seem to get anywhere, or they would take way too long to run. So the sorts of families that I'm talking about here, the most prominent one is known as lattice-based cryptography, or designing cryptosystems using a mathematical framework of lattices. A couple other ones are code-based cryptography, dealing with error-correcting codes. There's also multivariate algebra. There's isogenies of elliptic curves. And more recently, there's been some work designing symmetric key-based or hash function-based algorithms.
Before we continue, I've been personally funding the Finding Genius podcast for 4.5 years now, which has led to 2,700 plus interviews of clinicians, researchers, scientists, CEOs, and other amazing people who are working to advance science and improve our lives and our world. Even though this podcast gets 100,000 plus downloads a month, we need your help to reach hundreds of thousands more worldwide. Please visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click on Support Us. We have 3 levels of membership from $10 to $49 a month, including perks such as the ability to see ahead in our interview calendar and ask questions of upcoming guests, transcripts of podcasts you're interested in, the ability to request specific topics or guests, and more. Visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click Support Us today. Now back to the show.
So why are these not amenable to quantum computers as much as these other problems are? What is it about the mathematics of it that makes it, again, quantum could take an advantage, but it really probably won't, or it'd be much harder to? Like, why?
It's hard to nail that down exactly. People have looked at it, and they've looked at the known quantum algorithms, and they don't just seem to get anywhere. I'm not aware of a reason why you can say that lattices cannot be attacked by quantum. It could turn out that maybe they can, and just nobody has thought of the right way to do it yet.
But a fundamental weakness right now is error correction in quantum systems. So what if you had a system that was incredibly sensitive, where error propagation would build up massively quickly?
Yes, that's true. That is one of the difficulties with quantum computing. But the way that cryptosystems are designed, that issue is a little bit orthogonal to how the security of a cryptosystem is based. The public key cryptosystems that are designed are typically defined over finite fields, which are a discrete set of mathematics using a finite set of numbers, even though that set is very, very large. And it does use properties of errors, but it's not so small of errors that it's kind of the same issue that we're talking about in terms of error correction for quantum computers.
What about like chaotic systems where there's a strong dependence on initial conditions, like I guess in weather modeling stuff? Is that not particularly amenable to quantum computers?
I'm not totally sure. There have been some cryptographers who have looked at that idea, and it has not caught on among mainstream cryptography as being able to provide secure cryptosystems. Some of the more obscure cryptosystems that have used ideas like that have been broken, and so cryptographers tend to want to only use an idea after it's been published, it's been peer-reviewed, and it's been around for a number of time and been evaluated by experts, and nobody's been able to crack it.
Okay. What's the current state of the art of quantum computing in terms of qubits or some measure of computational capacity? What is that number, and where's the state of the art right now?
So the number of qubits in a quantum computer is one way to kind of measure the progress or the size of companies that are building this. There are other ways looking at the error correction rate. Qubit stands for quantum bit. It's kind of the quantum analog of what we use in classical computing. Is a bit is either a 0 or a 1. Current leaders in building quantum computers, companies like IBM and Google, they have built quantum computers that have hundreds of qubits. Now, these are physical qubits. In order to be really efficient and useful for a large-scale quantum computer, you're going to need to organize these physical qubits into what's called a logical qubit. And that will still take some engineering breakthroughs to make as many as we're going to need if we want to solve some really intricate problems or to break crypto systems. For example, if you're wanting to break RSA with a quantum computer, it's estimated you're going to need 3 to 5,000 logical qubits, which is going to translate into millions and millions of physical qubits. So we're not anywhere close to that yet in terms of the size of quantum computers today. Research being done, there are breakthroughs happening, but we're not currently at the level where we threaten cryptography.
But just out of an abundance of caution, this stuff's being researched now so that in the future, if there's leaps forward, then they could be counteracted.
Oh, definitely. And there's very good reason why we need to do this well in advance of a quantum computer being large enough to break cryptography. I can give you 2 reasons that I think are easy enough to understand. First, it takes time to do the research to come up with a new idea, to have experts evaluate it, and then to get it standardized. And then once it's standardized, that means companies will be able to take that standard, implementation of the algorithm and start putting it into their products and then start selling that. That whole process takes a couple decades to do. And if you're wanting to have an algorithm ready before a quantum computer, then you got to start that well in advance to make sure that all that research gets done, the standardization gets done. And even now that we just published the standards, it's still going to take a decade or two for most organizations to start using the cryptographic algorithms that we've standardized. So that's reason number 1. Reason number 2 is a little bit more counterintuitive, but it's a little bit more scary. It's known as harvest now, decrypt later, or store now, decrypt later. The scenario is this. Imagine that you've got all your data that you want to protect and you've encrypted it, so you feel good, nobody can read it. But suppose a foreign country or, some whatever, an enemy or adversary is able to copy your data. They get a hold of it somewhere because it's stored on the cloud or you transmitted it. And you're okay, it's encrypted, so you think I'm fine. But suppose they just wait 10 years until a quantum computer comes out and then they're able to get access to your data because they have a quantum computer. Well, if that information needs to be protected for longer than 10 years, you are already at risk today from attackers getting that data. And the amazing thing about that is the quantum computer is not even built that's going to get access to that data. It's coming along in 10, 15 years or whatever, but you're already at risk today. And so that helps underscore why, again, we need to have solutions ready decades or years in advance of when a quantum computer is big enough to threaten levels of security.
Has anyone ever been able to embed clocks where, you have encrypted data, but it has, again, instructions for a clock? So you check on the data, you query it periodically at a certain date I have no idea how the mechanism would work, but could you make data that would essentially expire or change its configuration after a certain period of time, when it's interacted with by a quantum device, let's say, or, classical computer to crack it, and therefore it remains to be, uncrackable?
It's a very interesting idea. There are some advanced functionalities of cryptography that look at ideas like that. I would say those aren't mainstream or efficient enough to be used in practice to where they're used in our computers, in our phones, in our servers, in our routers, things like that. So that's not, I'd say it's not kind of real world practical at this point.
Okay. I mean, I don't know if you can say what are some current ideas, that would address the preserve now and, decrypt later scenario.
Yeah. So at NIST, our role has been to select cryptography that the federal government uses. And we know that the algorithms that we standardize for federal government use, they tend to get adopted by industry and around the world. So we've known for a while that we have some standards that would be vulnerable to quantum attacks, particularly our public key cryptography ones. So back in 2016, we kicked off a process to develop solutions so the federal government would be ready. Basically what we did is we announced a international cryptographic competition. We put out a call to the experts around the world and asked them to design new algorithms that would be protected from both our current classical computers as well as future quantum computers, and then to send them in to us at NIST, and we would organize this evaluation process. So that was pretty cool to do, and they met the challenge. We had 82 different algorithms designed by cryptographic experts around the world that were sent in to us in 2017. We posted all of their specifications online on the web, including the code to implement the algorithms, and then we invited the cryptographic community around the world to try and break them, to try and test them, implement them, see how fast they are, try them in your applications, will they fit? And we did the same thing internally at NIST. So we ran this multi-year process, and back in 2 years ago, we were finally at the point where we could announce the winners of this process. We selected 4 algorithms that we would be standardizing as a result of the submissions that were sent in. These algorithms are known as Crystal's Kyber, Crystal's Dilithium, Falcon, and Sphinx Plus, just recently, last month, we were able to finish the standards that are based on those submissions, and they are now published in final so that people can begin to use these algorithms. And so that's a huge milestone of this project, but not just for our project, but for the security of the entire world, to have post-quantum algorithms that are standardized and can be put into products.
Okay. So what does the world look like, maybe 10 years from now, maybe 20? What do you expect we're going to see, how is our daily life going to change, or what products do we use will be affected by this?
So that's, interesting. So anytime you go online, you're using cryptography behind the scenes, whether you know it or not. If you go on Amazon and buy something, you're sending in your credit card, and you hope that that's encrypted so that people aren't stealing your credit card number. Or if you go to the doctor and he's recording, your health information, you sure hope that he's encrypting it so that people who are not supposed to don't have access to that information. So cryptography is everywhere, on your laptops, on your phones, your internet routers, ATMs, just every possible device. The goal of this project that we've had is, we know we need to transition to these new post-quantum algorithms, is that in 10 to 15 years after people have migrated to them, the average user won't notice that anything is different. Their information will continue to be protected, but it will be protected by these new algorithms, whether or not they know it. Where this gets interesting is the people who are in charge of this migration and making sure that data in your organization is protected. This transition is going to be complicated and costly and not very easy. So there's a lot of details to be worked out there that people need to be paying attention to this.
Okay, it makes sense. Where can people learn more about quantum computing in a publicly accessible or layperson's sense? What are some good resources for them?
So, of course, we have a web page. If you just Google NIST and post-quantum cryptography, or PQC, you'll easily come upon our web page, where we have a lot of good information about the cryptography that we're using that will protect us in the future. We don't have as much on what I would say is quantum computers themselves. For that, I would suggest you go to academic papers which track the progress, or similarly, companies that are making these computers have often done a lot of work to make very accessible to the public information. So companies like Google and IBM that are building these quantum computers will have resources where you can understand about what a quantum computer is and what's the progress in that.
Okay. And what about NIST? That's probably not much for the layperson, but does NIST put out any publications or areas on the website where they have the basics of quantum computing?
We do. We have some videos on our website as well that give a basic explainer into what a quantum computer is. We also focus more on post-quantum cryptography, though, even though the topic of quantum computing in general is of interest, and we have other NIST scientists working on that. My particular group, we're focused on the cryptographic side, and so that is where we have kind of more information dealing with that.
Okay, very good. Well, Dustin, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I appreciate it.
All right, thank you.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
You've been listening to the Finding Genius podcast with Richard Jacobs. If you like what you hear, be sure to review and subscribe to the Finding Genius podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And want to be smarter than everybody else? Become a premium member at findinggeniuspodcast.com. This podcast is for information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed.